for joining me in the discussion around growing a recovery ministry, how to love one another beyond addiction. My name is Linda Kemp-Baird, and I am honored to say that I am an ally for the recovery movement, which is now taking place throughout the state of Florida. What being an ally for recovery has done for me is to give me an opportunity to participate in changing my understanding about addiction. That it is possible to receive healing beyond addiction and to live a purpose-filled life of long-term recovery. Becoming an ally for recovery has given me an opportunity to participate in developing recovery-ready communities, not only in my home county of Volusia through the development of the Volusia Recovery Alliance, but also to support and develop other communities across the state of Florida to become recovery-ready communities as well. You might be asking, what is a recovery-ready community? Recovery-ready communities are cities, towns, and suburbs that welcome and invest in organizations which provide education to reduce the stigma around addiction and recovery. No longer must persons in long-term recovery remain anonymous in the basements and corners of church buildings. Persons in long-term recovery have an important story of hope to share about their transformation of life from a life of despair through active addiction to a life of healing and wholeness, which transforms them into responsible, viable, tax-paying, business-owning, voting citizens. Secondly, recovery-ready communities partner with their healthcare organizations, their jails, prisons, and treatment centers to employ peer recovery specialists and/or recovery coaches. Peer recovery specialists and recovery coaches are basically persons in long-term recovery who have gone through a long education and certification process. Their purpose is to mentor alongside someone, let's say as an example, someone in the emergency room who has just come out of an overdose. The peer recovery specialist will befriend that person and will walk with he or she out of the emergency room into a recovery-ready transition house that has in place positive, compassionate social support and a medically supervised treatment program. Another example of how to effectively use peer support specialists or recovery coaches is in the jail and prison system. There, positive relationships are developed right in the jail or the prison with someone who is incarcerated and a peer support specialist. When that person is then released from jail or prison, they are picked up by their peer support specialist rather than their drug dealer, who has always picked them up before and leading again to unfortunate consequences. The peer support specialist connects the newly released individual into positive support systems like transition housing with 12-step programs, or groups like Celebrate Recovery, Smart Recovery groups, or yoga groups, whatever support groups are available in the community. Thirdly, recovery-ready communities gather persons in long-term recovery and allies for recovery, gather them together to advocate with the local, the state, and the national governments to bring about legislative changes needed to make communities recovery-ready. An important area where advocacy is especially important right now for persons in long-term recovery is the exemption process from a criminal background. Persons who have been in recovery for over 30 years still have to check that they have a criminal background. That often keeps them from employment opportunities or being accepted for a loan for a new house. Even though they have fully paid back to society all retribution dollars and any other obligations that were decreed upon them. Additionally, in many local communities, it is extremely difficult to open recovery or transitional housing because of city ordinances which restrict that to happen. I know for a fact that the Volusia Recovery Alliance in Holly Hill and South Daytona, they are getting pushback to open a brick and mortar space in order to have a drop-in center for persons living with a substance use disorder or long-term recovery. So, recovery-ready communities are communities that are educated and aware that persons living with substance use disorder are not bad people that have to be turned into good people. Recovery-ready communities are communities whose citizens realize that persons living with a substance use disorder are sick people needing to get well. A great deal of research has gone into this realization. I will look to Dr. Aaron Wall, an emergency room physician accredited through the American College of Emergency Physicians and board member of the Florida College of Emergency Physicians, to teach us more about the brain disease of substance use disorder.
Why is an emergency doctor up here speaking about addiction? Because that's where the patients come. That's where our patients are the most vulnerable. They overdose and they seek treatment in the most vulnerable situation that they can be in. Sometimes right after an overdose, sometimes in profound withdrawal. And this environment is where peer specialists are the most effective, when patients are their most vulnerable and often the most mistrusting of healthcare providers. Although this is a talk of hope, I also want us to face the realities of addiction and substance use. If you look at substance use as a bush that's grown and it's a terrible thorny bush, we really have to look at the roots of addiction. And what are the roots of addiction? And I want to express to you that the roots of addiction are really rooted in these three diseases or deaths of despair. It's the number one reason why life expectancy in the United States has gone down 3 years in a row. The only time that's ever occurred was in the Spanish flu in 1918. And why is that? And the answer is because of diseases and deaths of despair. That is, drug dependence, alcohol dependence, and suicide. Why is it so prominent now? If you walk away or drive away from this lecture, I'd like you to understand a few terms. The most important is negative adverse social determinants. What are negative adverse social determinants? These are the conditions with which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. And because of long-term declines in education, employment, wages, childhood trauma, marital discord, and concurrent mental illness, these folks suffer from a loss of connection with others, never worse than it's been in COVID-19, and that leads to a hopelessness and cumulative disadvantage or deterioration. And because of that, these individuals look for an oblivion. They take part in risky behavior. They look for an oblivion such as alcohol or opioids. They take part in violence and they forego necessary health care. I want to remind us all, and this diminishes the stigma, that oftentimes the patient suffering from substance use disorder or opioid use disorder really experienced some negative, adverse childhood experiences. How can we blame a 9, 10, 12, 14-year-old for those experiences with which they endured when they were children? They present to us as a 30-year-old, and too often we say, wow, you've made some bad moral choices. No. They suffered some incredible adverse childhood experiences. We call those ACEs, ACEs. These are traumatic events that can have negative, long-lasting effects on their health and well-being. What are they? They're abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, emotional neglect, physical neglect, or even household challenges. They witness domestic violence. They witness substance abuse. They see others with mental illness. They witness and endure parental separation and divorce, as well as incarcerated parents. So why am I making this point? because people with 6 or more ACEs can die 20 years earlier than those who have had none. 1 out of 8 of the population have experienced more than 4 ACEs. And if you have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, you're 14 times more likely to suffer from suicide attempts. You're 11 times more likely to take part in IV drug abuse, 4 times as likely to have begun intercourse by the age of 15, and 4.5 times more likely to develop depression. And 67% of the population have at least one adverse childhood experience. So I want us again to express love and compassion to these patients. They've had a rough life. Our millennials from 1981 to 1996, those that are born, are more likely to die prematurely from suicide and drug overdose than any other previous generation. We call their generation the bad luck cohort. Drug-related deaths among millennials have more than doubled from 2007 to 2017. Alcohol-related deaths in this age group, think about it, they are dying from alcohol, have rose by 70%, and suicides by 35%. Millennials have almost double the rate of anxiety disorder compared to baby boomers. And why is that? Again, it goes back to those negative social determinants. They have more financial strain than previous generations. Housing, rent is much more expensive now. Good jobs available to people without college degrees have essentially evaporated. There's rising healthcare costs. There's decline in manufacturing jobs, which gave these folks a support system and a meaningful job. You could graduate with a high school diploma and go work for an automobile manufacturer or a coal mine, in fact. And that's why, with the dissolution of these jobs, it's no surprise that the Midwestern states or the Rust Belt and the Appalachian states were the epicenter of the opioid crisis in the early 90s. And life satisfaction often comes from meaning and purpose associated with a job. And when we have Facebook and Twitter staring at our faces, we're compelled to compare ourselves to others. We have our blooper reels in our own head, and everyone else's highlight reel is in the palm of our hands. And so it's no surprise they look for an outlet. But there is hope. There's real, genuine hope. And that hope starts when we begin to look at addiction as a complex brain disease. Prolonged drug use actually causes lasting effects on our brain structure and function. It literally rewires our neural networks. And I want to introduce you to the fact that there is medications that can help people refrain from using illicit drug use. These medications associated with the proper counseling sharply reduce the risk of overdose and death, leading to improvements in behavior associated with addiction. These patients on these medications are more apt to succeed with behavioral therapy, such as psychosocial counseling, treatment for co-occurring disorders, motivational counseling, and very importantly, as I've mentioned, vocational rehabilitation. Why is that? It's because our brain is rewired. When I mention rewiring of the brain, we have an area of our frontal brain we call the frontal cortex. This is what we use to make rational decision making, thinking, reasoning, learning. Deeper in our brain, we have an area called the amygdala. This is where we have our stress response. This is our alligator brain, if you will. It looks for food, for reproduction, protection of kin, protection of oneself. It does our fight or flight response. And when you become a chronic user, it also is the area of the brain that has the need to avoid withdrawals. So users will do anything to avoid withdrawal, and they literally disconnect their frontal cortex. So everybody judges these patients and stigmatizes them and says, boy, they make the worst decisions. It's literally not their fault. Their brain has been rewired. They will do anything to avoid withdrawal. They will lie, they will cheat, they will be manipulative, they will sell themselves, they will break into your car to get a radio to avoid withdrawal. Again, there is hope. We can offer medications for addiction treatment, also known as MAT. It used to be called medications for medication-assisted treatment, but now it's our primary modality. It's the gold standard for treatment. Medications for addiction treatment in combination with behavioral therapies to treat opioid use disorder helps reduce rates of illicit drug use and overdose by reestablishing that normal brain function. It reduces drug cravings. It prevents relapses, which nowadays with powerful illicit fentanyl is often fatal. We used to say in alcoholism, let's give them 8 or 9 times to relapse. We can't afford relapse in our loved ones who are suffering from opioid use disorder because relapse is so associated with a high chance of fatality if they get a high percentage of fentanyl in their next dose. MAT, or medications for addiction treatment, also lowers the risk of contracting infectious diseases, namely hepatitis C, HIV, and a terrible heart valve infection called endocarditis. If you're in your car and you're wondering, wow, this guy, he's really just replacing one addiction for another, I want you to understand the most important point of this lecture. Addiction is labeled as the following: continued compulsive use despite negative social consequences. In addition, it's oftentimes associated with profound dishonesty. Continued compulsive use despite negative social consequences and dishonesty. What are those negative social consequences? They're the perpetual cycling of highs and lows. They're acquisition harms associated with poverty, crime, and frantic behavior. They're injection harms, local infections, endocarditis, and then, of course, street drug harms like accidental overdose or death. What are other negative social consequences? Going to your job intoxicated, having your loved one question you and ask you about your use and denying it. What I'm trying to say is that is addiction. If I asked all of you in your cars today, most of you might incorrectly assume that you are addicted to caffeine. You are not addicted to caffeine. You are dependent on caffeine. Why do I say that? Myself, if I don't have caffeine, I get terrible headaches in the morning. Am I addicted to caffeine? No, I am not. Has my boss ever been disappointed with my caffeine use? No. Have I ever lied to anybody about my caffeine use? No. Have I ever broken into anyone's car to obtain caffeine? No. Have I ever injected myself with caffeine and exposed myself to terrible infections? No. And neither have any of you. I also am dependent on blood pressure medication. Am I addicted to it? No, because there's no negative social consequences associated with my use, and I also don't lie about my use of blood pressure medications. So once you understand that paradigm difference, you can understand why medications for these patients are so important. We're talking about an organic brain structural disease. And when we get patients on a normal dose, which is very stable, they're not high, they're not low, they have scheduled opioid consumption, and they are free from those addiction harms. I want us also to change our paradigm about recovery. What does recovery mean in 2020? Recovery is a process of change where people improve their health and wellness, live self-directed lives, and strive to reach their full potential. Remission or recovery should not be taken to mean complete cessation of opioid misuse, but instead we should all acknowledge that marked reduction in use is a worthy and laudable goal. I also want to say that abstinence and detoxification for this patient population rarely works. The alternative to medications for addiction treatment is not a drug-free patient. Rather, it's a continually relapsing patient, and relapse has a high association with death. Is this my idea? Did I come here with these ideas and I'm just promoting them? No. This is supported by all of the national professional societies in addiction medicine, all of the professional societies for emergency medicine and toxicology. And lastly, it's even supported by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine.
What might you have taken away from Dr. Wool's lecture? Highlights that stand out for me are: 1. Substance use disorder is a terrible, thorny bush within our communities. Addiction involves not only the individual, but his or her family. With addiction, there is an increase in negative social consequences such as crime, violence, and homicide. Our emergency rooms have become filled with persons who have overdosed or are in withdrawal. Police departments and sheriff's offices are inundated with addressing these crises. Emergency room physicians report that they often have 4 overdose cases a day, when perhaps 15 years ago, they had 4 overdose cases a month. A statistic that I have found interesting is that for every $1 spent on recovery services within a community, there will be $15 saved for social support services such as law enforcement, or emergency room costs, or destruction of personal property. That's a powerful ratio. For every $1 spent on recovery, $15 are saved in social support services. It's a win-win all around. Number 2, opioid use disorder and alcohol dependence, along with suicide, are diseases related to depths of despair, which has decreased life expectancy in the United States for the first time in many, many years, especially for the millennial adults born between 1981 and 1996. Number 3, persons struggling with substance use disorder have often experienced negative adverse childhood trauma. They have been subjected to divorce, neglect, poverty, violence, emotional or physical abuse, just to name a few. Type in your internet browser for websites related to adverse childhood experiences. The acronym ACE, ACE. You will be led to many viable websites providing great information about trauma that so many people are experiencing. Number 4, perhaps the diagnosis of substance use disorder as a brain disease is new to you. This is based on the past few years of intensive brain research because of Alzheimer's disease and other cognitive loss-related diseases. Substance use disorder involves 2 parts of the brain: the frontal cortex, which provides rational decision-making, over the amygdala, which is the fight or flight part of the brain. Substance use disorder is when the frontal cortex has absolutely no control over the amygdala because the wires between the 2 parts of the brain no longer function properly due to the substance use. Sheriff Dennis Lima from Seminole County asked us to imagine what it would be like to be held underwater against our will to the point that we desperately need oxygen. Of course, we would struggle and fight and resist whatever is keeping us from oxygen so that we can breathe again. Well, there is the same desperate effect on someone needing a fix. They literally are not in their right mind. They will do anything to keep them from going into withdrawal, which is like for us, the fear of not being able to breathe. People in active addiction, in fear of withdrawal, will steal from their family. They will break into other people's property. They will threaten people with violence. They are not in their right mind. 5, I also hope that you heard Dr. Wool's encouragement that there is hope. in the midst of this despairing disease of substance use disorder and the epidemic of lives being lost. He spoke of saving lives through medications for addiction treatment, MAT. This treatment for substance use disorder is like prescribing insulin for someone living with the chronic disease of diabetes. There is hope. Dr. Wool reports that it is a success when someone has a marked reduction in use. People are being kept alive. People are being healed from substance use disorder slowly and steadily, one person at a time. Referencing again Sheriff Dennis Lima, he shares that inside the Seminole County Jail, MAT programs are up and running. Peer-certified specialists, peer recovery specialists, have been employed to mentor incarcerated SUD, substance use disorder patients, or prisoners in this case. The Sheriff's Office is collaborating with Advent Health to open a Hope and Healing Center where the incarcerated can go to serve their sentence away from the hardcore incarcerated. The objective of this is to get them out of the criminal justice system and into healing services, which is where they belong. The next step for Seminole County is to open a crisis stabilization center. Sheriff Lima is not the first person to say that the Baker Act is in desperate need of reform. Within the Crisis Stabilization Center, care will be provided which builds trust and compassion between the person and family in crisis and the law enforcement officers. Walmart has pledged $750,000 over the next 2 years to underwrite these special recovery services. Sheriff Lima states that their goal is to make sick people well, not bad people good. Last but certainly not least, there is hope in what we, you and me, can do to make our communities recovery ready. Sheriff Lima challenges all of us to help change the face of addiction. He offers himself as a speaker for any church group or organizations. I recommend it. His presentations are excellent. I will have his contact information in the Q&A session. Also, I know several persons across the state of Florida who would be happy to speak and provide education for your group. We are in need of education, especially within our congregations. We are in need of education to learn that the face of addiction is no longer someone living under a bridge, but the face of addiction are responsive, caring, compassionate, serving individuals in our community who live with long-term recovery. They are our neighbors. They are our colleagues. They are our family members and friends' families. Let's support them and other persons who may be seeking healing through recovery-ready communities. As a faith-based community, I encourage you to get involved in recovery services in your community. Get educated and address any stigma or stereotypes you might have directly involved with persons living with substance use disorder. Contact your local emergency room, your police or your sheriff's departments to see what they are doing in response to this social crisis, this overdose epidemic. Find out from them what needs they have. Also, whenever you consider a recovery ministry, have a person in long-term recovery at the table with you. Persons with lived experience have been kept away from decision-making for too long. Remember that family members are persons in recovery as well. I look forward to our question and answer period, which will follow this video. I will have with me a person with lived experience, and we will be considering together 10 myths of addiction. Also, I will provide a list of resources which may be of interest for you. I look forward to hearing your voices, your comments, and questions. Peace be with you all.